Hey y'all, my name is Kat Moonchild. I am a psychic, medium, Reiki master, and a shaman in training. So today we were actually going to talk about that specific thing, shaman in training. So what does that actually mean? What do I mean when I say I'm a shaman? If you go back into my history, and I will link the video down below, I did previously do a video about shamanism, what that was, certain shamanic practices, and what it takes to actually be a shaman. So let's actually kind of recap on some of that. And this video is actually going to be talking about specifically shamanism, what it takes to be a shaman, why I'm saying I'm a shaman in training now, that I'll be graduating November 2022. So I have roughly a month and a half left before I'm done. I'm really excited. I've been so excited about it. So let me explain that. Shamanism is actually a word created by the Western Hemisphere, by Westerners. Shaman is not a word that is used by people of indigenous lineage. They'll say medicine person. We've heard the term witch doctor. That's not as common or not as popular. They may use the word priest or priestess in their native language. There's so many different things that they use in lieu of that. So when we're talking about shamanic practices, according to how Westerners understand it, it is specifically practices that do connect with indigenous practice. So most of the time when people think of shamanic practices, they do think of Native American lineage. Just because somebody's got a indigenous bloodline, whether it be Native American or not, does not automatically make them shamanic. Period. I did end up finding I had a certain amount of indigenous blood inside of my bloodline. I cannot claim shamanism just because the blood exists. So let's kind of take a look at that. Most importantly, the thing we want to understand is when somebody claims to have a shamanic practice or that they are a shaman, we want to really respect that this is coming from a lineage. A lineage connects to a culture or a bloodline. So when somebody says they're a shaman, those specific spiritual practices come from a culture that have connected those practices to their belief system and their spirituality. Not all shamanic practices are created equal. Not all shamanic practices hail from the same lineage. There are so many different types of indigenous backgrounds. We have hundreds of different types of tribes just in Native American lineages alone, let alone around the world. So when people are talking about they are shamans, oftentimes people from indigenous bloodlines who do practice get offended or upset because this is something that has been passed down for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years through their practices, their beliefs, their cultures that they protect. And we want to honor their practices. The next thing we want to understand too is that a lot of those practices, there are two different types of points of view in the shamanic realm, or in people that practice shamanic style healings or spirituality. There's two different things. There are secular practices, which are closed practices, and open practice. Most open practices at this point, which means a culture that is willing to share their practice with specific people, do come from Latin America. So you're looking at things like Peru, Ecuador, some people in the Amazon. People in Latin America or Southern America have, with a great honor to them, brought their practices to us, but even still, not all those practices are completely true that they share with us to the original practices themselves, because these are things that are taught over their entire lives. This is their culture. This is the way they were brought up. This is the way that they lived. This is the way that they learned. And we want to honor and respect that this is their sacred practice that they're sharing with us. And they're sharing a variation or a version of those practices. And we want to understand the difference. So many people that look at shamanic practices that are secular or closed practices are like, why are those practices closed? Such as Native American practices that are closed and only connected with people that are in the bloodline or have been invited into the tribe. And that is because they don't want those practices perverted. Those practices are something that they hold sacred and dear to them. And many people that have a well-meaning intention can take those practices and change them in essence, or they don't connect to the deep, rich history and culture of those practices that were created over hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's within their right to not want to share those practices, to keep them protected so that people are not taking those practices and transforming them. That's what ends up happening oftentimes when new practices are shared, such as Reiki. If you look at Reiki, the original Reiki practice was Reiki Usui Ryoho, and now there's so many different types of Reiki. There's literally hundreds of different practices based on one practice alone that have branched out and changed it, and everyone has their own interpretation, everyone has their own style, everyone says how it should be. So when we're looking at the indigenous culture that have secular closed practices for shamanic style practice, healing, sacred work, we respect it. Because people will come in, people will change the methods. We want to respect them and leave it be and not ask for what is not ours to take, because that is also how they heal their ancestral wounds, their ancestral lineage. And many of them had been under threat of having their culture, which this is part of their culture destroyed hundreds of years ago. And actually, in some cases, only 200 years ago. Some of it actually went into the early 1900s up until the 1950s to 1980s. As early as 40 years ago, some of those cultures had been suppressed and silenced. So we don't want to try to be like, we have a right to those practices. For our Native American tribes, that's their practices. We should greatly respect them. Indigenous lines, shamanic practices, and shamana style work also can connect with African tribe. African tribes can also connect to, again, Latin American tribes such as Taino. So when we're looking at shamanic practices, we want to understand that this is such a multicultural, multi-ethnic group. It can't be connected to just one line, but the most important thing is they all have lineages and they all have cultures. This is why when people say that they're a shaman that was initiated by the universe, these people do get frustrated, because these are things that were oppressed and taken from some of these people by force. So we do want to respect and honor that. Going into open practices, and the particular practice I do is a variation of a shamanic practice from the Quiero people, which are mountain shamans, and there are mountain shamans and jungle shamans, and in some cases desert shamans, and they all have their own style and their own connection to spirit and how spirit works and how it functions. But they do have similar key factors, such as working with the soul. But not all practices are created equal, so we want to respect that too. This particular practice that is open practice that was shared by the Kaale people from the mountains of Peru were brought down, and we were gifted a variation of that practice. You can find information about that specific practice at the Four Winds Society. I am currently working with and in class for that specific style of shamanism. I will use the word shaman because this is something that we in the Western Hemisphere do understand, but please understand, if we go to those people out in Peru and use the word shaman, they're not going to understand what the heck we're talking about. They do use the word priest and priestess, more priest. That's really something that we want to keep in mind. So when we're holding shamanism in respect, we want to respect, not all of them are the same. They all have different practices. Some include animals, some don't. Some include the 4 directions or the 8 directions, some don't. And they all mean different things to these different lineages. And they're all lineage-based practice. So just because, for example, I have blood, I am not part of that particular bloodline. That particular blood kind does come from Latin America. It is indigenous. I don't connect with that culture, and I don't claim that culture in practice of shamanism because that particular bloodline has its own style. The style of shamanism I do in lineage work does connect with the Peruvian people, which is not part of my bloodline. This is where you see the difference. And we have been greatly honored to have that particular practice open. So there are several Latin American lines that are wanting to share their practice, enrich their culture, share it with the world, and connect with it. And there are several lineages and several lines that don't want to. Either way, we respect both, and either way, we connect with both. And the most important thing we want to remember is this is sacred work, and this is a sacred practice. So keep that in mind. If you are interested in more research on lineage and line, please, 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 definitely, I encourage you to go forth and look it up. Again, the particular practice I do is the Four Winds Society. You'll see information on Munai Ki in that particular practice. This is something that is more open to the general community. It is something that does take a lot of dedication and hard work. But again, a lot of these practices are practices that are taught over 20 years in a culture that was condensed into 1 or 2 years for us. So it's not going to be the same. It is different, but a lot of these practices are still authentic, but they are watered down. They are changed. So we want to understand and respect that. And that's also for our protection. That's also for our spiritual safety and our emotional safety. There's so much beautiful, rich information and history, but the most important thing we want to take it away is that we're respecting each path and each practice the way it is, and we want to cultivate an understanding of what those practices are, how they work, how they function within that culture, and not demand for that to be shared with us. To respect those that are closed or secular practices, to look for information where it is open and is shared, and we can connect, respect, and receive that information with love and gratitude, because they didn't have to share that information with us. So I love you all. Thank you so much for joining me on this quick little, informational tutorial on shamanism and shamanic practices, the difference, bloodline, culture, history. And if there's any discussion or anyone that is of a lineage or a bloodline that does want to comment or share any corrections or anything that you feel needed to be added to the video that I did not add, I would be more than happy to receive that from you. But most importantly, this video is really educational in understanding what a shamanic practice is. Again, I will claim the word shaman due to the fact that I am connected with Four Winds Society. That does not mean that I'm connected with every single culture or connected with every single lineage, but I am proud and honored to be working with ancestors, proud and honored to be able to be connected to a lineage and a line. Very greatly honored very appreciative for the Peruvian tribes that have offered that wisdom and knowledge to us. So please, guys, make sure you're checking out not only the Four Winds Society, but the Q'ero people that have brought that to us, and that we're supporting them as a tribe and as a culture for all the wisdoms that they have shared with us in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you so much for joining me. Remember, you can follow me on TikTok at the same name, Psychic Cat Moonchild. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Moonchild Dreams. I'll see you all later. Take care.